Welcome back after the break. You're watching Indus News and I'm Fiza Jamal with our main stories in detail. We start with Kashmir, where an unarmed Kashmiri youth has been martyred by Indian occupying forces in Srinagar amid a total lockdown of the valley. Occupation forces have also arrested over 100 others in the past 12 hours. Occupied Kashmir is under a crushing curfew since the last 72 hours after India unilaterally announced its accession. In defiance of the Indian oppression, Kashmiri took to the streets to protest New Delhi's revocation of their right to self-determination. Occupying forces baton charged the unarmed peaceful protesters and fired tear gas. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has summoned a second meeting of the National Security Committee, which is starting shortly. This comes after India dropped Article 370, ending the occupied valley special status as a disputed territory. The meeting will discuss the recommendations of Parliament and decisions taken by yesterday's Corps Commanders Conference. Khan also discussed India's illegal accession of occupied Kashmir with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman over the phone. While speaking to Parliament yesterday, the Premier said India's decision to revoke the article is based on an extremist ideology. He also said the special status of occupied Kashmir is protected under international law and to revoke it is against UN resolutions. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has formed a 7-member committee to review the political, diplomatic and legal aspects of the Kashmir situation. 18 people have been killed and 95 others wounded in a car bomb explosion outside a police station in Kabul. The Taliban have claimed responsibility. The Afghan Interior Ministry says the injured have been moved to hospital. This comes as the US and Taliban negotiate a peace deal ahead of the September 28th Afghan polls. Meanwhile, Venezuela's government says it will continue talks with the opposition despite US economic sanctions. Opposition leader Juan Guaido also says he is ready to continue dialogue with President Nicolas Maduro's administration. Foreign Minister Jorge Arrezia said Venezuela would not surrender to US pressure and will bypass the latest round of sanctions. But US National Security Advisor John Bolton said Washington will impose sanctions on any company doing business with Caracas. On Monday, Washington seized all Venezuelan government's US-based assets. Israel has approved the construction of more than 2,300 illegal settlement homes in the occupied West Bank. A local NGO, Peace Now, says the building plans are the latest in a surge of such approvals since US President Donald Trump took office in 2017. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to annex much of the West Bank during his election campaign earlier this year. His government began demolishing dozens of Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem last month. The United States and Saudi Arabia say they will work together to counter Iran's aggressive efforts to disrupt oil supplies in the Persian Gulf. Meeting in Washington, Saudi Energy Minister Khalid Al-Faleh and U.S. Energy Secretary Rick Perry promised to ensure the smooth supply of oil to global markets. In a statement, they said they would tackle Iran's attempts to disrupt supplies. This comes after Iran seized a second vessel in the Gulf earlier this week, claiming it was carrying smuggled fuel. Turkey says it will soon launch a military operation against Kurdish militias in northern Syria. This comes after Washington warned Ankara it would prevent any unilateral incursion into Syrian territory. Speaking in Ankara, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey is determined to destroy all arms of the PKK militant group. He promised to intervene to create a safe zone in Syria. Erdogan said the military operation would also enable Syrian refugees to return home. He demanded the U.S. to cease arming Kurdish militias and extradite FETO leader Fethullah Gulen for his involvement in a failed 2016 coup. And 4 members of the Syrian Democratic Forces have been killed in 2 separate attacks in the eastern Deir ez-Zor province. The US-backed SDF carried out an anti-ISIS operation in Deir ez-Zor's Baghouz district. The Syrian Observatory says 2 soldiers were killed after unidentified gunmen opened fire on them in Suidan Jazeera village, while 2 other soldiers were killed in Al-Shohail town by a roadside IED explosion when a military vehicle was passing by. No group has yet claimed responsibility for the attacks. A Pentagon report earlier said ISIS is resurging in Syria less than 5 months after President Donald Trump declared their defeat in the region. The UN Human Rights Office has accused Yemeni security forces of perpetrating retaliatory attacks against citizens from the country's north. UN spokeswoman Ravina Shamdasani says the organization has received complaints about forced displacement, assaults, and harassment. She said the security forces are carrying out retaliatory attacks against civilians from northern Yemen. The spokeswoman added the alleged targeting of northerners is in retaliation for last week's deadly attacks by rebels. 49 people were killed in 2 attacks on government-held Aden on Yemen's southern coast. North Korea has called its latest missile launches an adequate warning over the US and South Korea's joint military drills. Pyongyang conducted its 4th short-range missile test in less than 2 weeks, warning it might pursue a new road. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un inspected the launch of a new type of tactical guided missile to verify its war capacity. The exercises are taking place despite Pyongyang's warnings they would jeopardize nuclear negotiations between the US and North Korea. Meanwhile, US National Security Advisor John Bolton reminded Kim of his pledge to President Donald Trump. Kim had promised not to resume launching intercontinental range missiles that threaten the US. In other news, the Philippines has declared dengue a national epidemic after the death toll from the outbreak topped 600. The outbreak follows the banning of an ineffective French dengue vaccine, which caused dozens of children's deaths over the past 2 years. The health department says 150,000 cases of dengue were recorded between January and July. It said children below the age of 10 have been worst affected by the disease. Officials say most of the country has been affected by the epidemic. Members of the United Nations have signed an agreement to make it easier to settle cross-border commercial disputes. The Singapore Convention on Mediation has been signed by 46 countries, including the US and China. This comes amid rising trade tensions between the world's top 2 economies, Washington and Beijing. Elsewhere, Japan and South Korea have locked horns over trade tariffs. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said the convention will help advance international trade, commerce, and investment. Loong said the signatories have come together to declare they are open for business. UN Legal Affairs Assistant Secretary General Stephen Matias said he hopes the convention will improve the credibility of mediation. The United Nations has voiced concern over a new Italian law imposing stiffer penalties on NGO migrant rescue boats in the Mediterranean. The European Union also says it plans to analyze the legislation's consistency with European law. The UNHCR says rescue boats must not be redirected to Libya, given the extremely volatile security situation in the country.
NGOs play an invaluable role in saving the lives of refugees and migrants attempting the dangerous sea crossing to Europe. Their commitment and humanity should not be criminalized nor stigmatized. The extremely volatile security situation, ongoing conflict, widespread report of human rights violations, and routine use of arbitrary detention underline the fact that it is not a viable place of safety.
Drawn up by Interior Minister Matteo Salvini, the decree passed by Italy's parliament hikes the maximum fines for ships illegally entering Italian waters. The fine has been increased from 50,000 to 1 million euros. Moving on, United Kingdom's opposition Labour Party says it will back a second referendum in Scotland to decide whether it will remain in post-Brexit Britain. Speaking in Edinburgh, Labour's deputy leader John McDonnell said the party will not block the vote. He said the Labour Party believes the people of Scotland have a democratic right to decide their future. This comes after a recent opinion poll showed 52% of Scottish voters now back in succession from the UK. Well, now it's time for us to take a very short break, but don't go anywhere because coming up next in the Bulletin. Organic poo powder to power farm equipment, cook food and charge phones. Source of wonder to tourists and joy to merchants. Welcome back. After the break, we'll continue with our main stories in detail. Colombia has announced it will grant citizenship to 24,000 children born to Venezuelan parents in its territory since August 2015. The move aims to safeguard the fundamental rights to stateless infants. Until now, Colombian law only allowed children of foreigners who legally reside in the country to apply for citizenship. The children will also have access to health and education. According to immigration authorities, more than 1.4 million Venezuelans are in Colombia after fleeing the economic crisis in the oil-rich nation. Many of these migrants entered Colombia without a passport. More than 3,000 people are believed to have disappeared in Chile after the 1973 coup. 43 years later, 1,000 people are still listed as missing. Their families say the government is not serious about finding their loved ones. More in this report.
Augusto Pinochet assumed power in Chile after a United States-backed coup in 1973. Soon after coming into power, Pinochet launched a crackdown on leftist leaders. Thousands were dragged from their homes, never to be found. Their families haven't lost hope and continue to look for them.
And the search, the fight happened for long years. And we keep going so that no other generation, no other person goes through what we have been through. Living in uncertainty and not knowing anything about what happened to our relatives.
The victims' families accuse successive governments of disinterest in the matter. Family associations accuse the army of withholding information as part of a pact of silence.
And perhaps this is the most outrageous thing. Because we know who has the information, we know where the information is, and nobody dares to look for it. Why the courts have never called to give testimony, for example, to the ministers at the time, it was a dictatorship. Nobody there was deciding on their own.
The United Nations has also expressed its concern over missing persons. It has also advised Chile to intensify its efforts to open up investigations or accelerate those already ongoing.
More than $2 million worth of gold coins were stolen when armed robbers broke into a Mexican government coin manufacturer. Security officials say the coins were stolen from a vault that had been left open. Police say 2 people broke into a Casa de Moneda branch in the morning after throwing a security guard to the ground. Security officials say the robbers filled a backpack with 1,567 gold coins. Criminal activities in Mexico have increased during record lawlessness plaguing the country. Thousands of people in Turkey are protesting against the impact of a Canadian-owned gold mining on the local environment. Activists say the cyanide being used to extract gold is contaminating the soil and water from a nearby dam. Protests near the western town of Kirazli have attracted large numbers of activists since late July. They say the Canadian company has cut down 4 times the number of trees allowed by its mining concession. The Turkish government has rejected the protesters' claims. And in sad news, Nobel laureate and Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison has died at the age of 88. She was the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Toni Morrison wrote 11 novels in her career that lasted over 6 decades. Many of Morrison's novels are based on life as an African-American. She received numerous other accolades, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. In Kenya, people are using an organic poo powder to power farm equipment, cook food, and charge their phones. Experts have hailed the practice as climate friendly. 100,000 Kenyans have received access to biogas in their homes since 2009. This report has the details.
As African cities expand, farmers are learning how to make do with less land. Desertification and deforestation have further stressed agriculture on the continent. Farmers in Kenya may have a solution to the problem: biodigesters.
I don't buy gas anymore. I use it for cooking. I even sometimes boil githeri because it's a lot. It's very convenient for me. I've been using firewood, charcoal. I don't use anymore. In fact, I'm planning to use it for brooding chicken.
Farmers store dung in underground containers until it breaks down into compost and biogas. The UN's top climate change panel says such efforts are needed while African governments try to feed a growing population.
After 2 hours, you start seeing the guy. You write it in the kitchen, and it's just like a miracle. Yeah? Something which you never thought you can make use of it in that way. It becomes something very amazing.
The compost also leaves behind a bioslurry that can help make over farmed soil usable again. Many of Nigeria's farmers have called the biogas boom a miracle.
And in Newfoundland, Canada, icebergs are a source of wonder to tourists and joy to merchants. More and more ice giants from Greenland are drifting to this island in eastern Canada. Some see it as a boon, others as a stark illustration of the accelerated melting of the Arctic. More in this report.
Every summer in Newfoundland, Edward Keane goes hunting for icebergs. Keane and his crew collect ice blocks that have floated down thousands of miles from Greenland's glaciers, a sight that's becoming more common as temperatures rise.
They're going to die in a couple, 3 weeks, and naturally be gone back to nature anyway. So we're not here hurting the environment.
The water from the glaciers of the Arctic is renowned for its purity because it was frozen long before the air pollution of the Industrial Revolution. Over 2 months, Keane and his crew can recover about 800,000 litres of iceberg water, which they sell to traders at $1 a litre. Kerry Chalk then bottles the ice water and sells it at the markup price of $20 US. Between May and July each year, hundreds of icebergs break away from Greenland's glaciers and ice sheet and drift to the Canadian coast. For the past 4 years, former fisherman Barry Strickland has organised tourist excursions around icebergs, which often sell out.
Just keep getting better every year. You know, we got tour buses coming here now. You can't see behind you there, but we just had a tour bus coming in now. We got 135, 140 tour buses, you know, with older people coming into the town every season. So.
Greenland's ice experienced a record thaw in June 2019, and the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. But for these coastal communities, the icebergs that venture down from Greenland could be floating white nights.
In business news, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation has agreed to pay $336 million to settle a tax fraud. HSBC's Swiss private banking arm has been charged by Belgian prosecutors with carrying out fraudulent activities in the country. The prosecutors say the bank encouraged the evasion of EU savings tax by creating offshore companies in tax havens. They say it also carried out illegal activities in the Caribbean for wealthy Belgian clients. HSBC has pledged a significant overhaul of its practices to counter financial crime risks. This comes as European governments have stepped up their pressure on banks and tax havens in recent years. India's central bank has cut its key lending rate for the fourth time this year to counter slowing economic growth. The Reserve Bank of India cut its repo lending rate to commercial banks by 35 basis points to 5.4%. The RBI said the cut would help address growth concerns by boosting aggregate demand and targeting private investment as a priority. Along with 3 earlier rate cuts, the RBI has reduced its short-term lending rate by 1.1% so far this year. This follows a marked deceleration of 8 core industries, including the automobile sector. Meanwhile, China has said more than 10,000 5G base stations will be built in Beijing by the end of this year. Beijing's telecom authorities said the capital city has already constructed 8,000 stations up to July. It says most of the bases are located in venues for the Horticultural Expo and the 2022 Winter Olympics. The authorities say 5G technology is expected to create more than 8 million jobs in the next 10 years. European stock markets have opened in positive territory after Asian bourses had a mixed trading day. Investor sentiment was buoyed by the $3.9 billion sale of chemical park operator Currenta by Germany's Bayer and Lanxess groups. The DAX in Frankfurt and Paris's CAC index are both trading about 1% higher. London's FTSE 100 index is up 0.5% despite losses reported by major mining companies. Asian bourses closed mixed after the White House said it would pursue scheduled trade talks with China in September. The Nikkei 225, Shanghai Composite, and Kospi indices all closed down a fraction. Well, as we bear the heat in Lahore, let's see what the weather is looking like today around the globe. Well, these are all the main stories in detail I have for you this hour. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.